You wake up. Before your feet even touch the floor, you've already checked your phone, not because you needed to, but because silence feels uncomfortable now. You scroll through lives you don't recognize, opinions you didn't ask for, and people telling you how to live while you're barely awake enough to remember your own name. Your ancestors woke up to lions. You wake up to notifications. They spent their days hunting, building, surviving. You spend yours clicking, consuming, and slowly forgetting what any of this is even for. And here's the part no one wants to admit. We're not more advanced than the people who lived 70,000 years ago. We're just more distracted. We like to tell ourselves this is progress, that smartphones, cities, money, and careers mean we've evolved. But what if we didn't evolve? What if we just built a prettier cage and convinced ourselves it's freedom? You live in the safest era in human history, with the most comfort, the most knowledge, and the most tools ever created, and yet anxiety, depression, and meaninglessness are everywhere. So here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask. If this is the peak of human civilization, why does it feel so empty? That question is exactly why this book exists, and once you see its answer, you don't get to unsee it. This video is based on the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. Before we go any further, quick but necessary disclaimer, this video falls under the Fair Use Act of YouTube. It is intended for educational, critical, and transformative purposes only. We are not replacing the book, we are analyzing it, challenging it, and reframing it with new context and commentary. Now, let's talk about the man who wrote a book that made millions of people deeply uncomfortable. Who is Yuval Noah Harari? Yuval Noah Harari is an Israeli historian, philosopher, and professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He specializes in world history, evolutionary biology, and the long-term future of humanity. But Harari isn't famous because he memorized dates or kings. He's famous because he did something most historians are too scared to do. He zoomed out. Instead of asking what happened, he asked, why do we believe the stories we do? And that's what Sapiens really is. This is not a history book in the traditional sense. There are no heroes, no comforting narratives, no humanity is special bedtime stories. This book does one brutal thing over and over again. It strips humans of their self-importance. Harari's core argument is simple and absolutely humiliating if you take it seriously. Humans don't rule the world because we're stronger, or smarter, or morally superior. We rule the world because we believe in made-up stories better than any other species ever has. Money, nations, religion, human rights, corporations, even the idea of progress itself. None of these exist in nature. They exist because enough people agree to pretend they do. And that agreement, shared belief, turned a weak, anxious ape into the most destructive force this planet has ever seen. Sapiens walks through 4 major revolutions: how we learn to imagine, how we learn to control food, how we learn to organize strangers, and how we learn to play God. But here's where this video is going to be different from every polite summary you've heard before. We're not just explaining the book, we're confronting it. Because if Harari is right, even partially, then most of what you've been taught about success, happiness, and meaning is built on stories that don't love you back. And once you realize that, you have 2 options. Keep pretending the cage is comfortable, or start questioning who built it and why. In the next section, we'll dive into the first core idea of the book: how humans went from insignificant animals to imaginary gods. Not through strength, but through lies we learn to believe together. And fair warning, this is where people usually start getting mad. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. The accident that became everything. You want to know how a random ape, literally no different in potential than any other animal, accidentally became the ruler of the entire planet? Not because it was stronger, not because it was faster, and sure as hell not because it was inherently better. It happened because of one thing our ancestors invented somewhere around 70,000 years ago. the ability to tell stories that other humans would believe. Not fairy tales, not bedtime fables, strategic, fictional constructs that triggered cooperation at massive scale. Before this shift, our ancestors were just another primate in the savannah. We scratched at the earth, scavenged food, watched lions roam, and fought for survival just like every other species. We weren't special. If an asteroid or a supervolcano had hit, there's a good chance we'd be sitting in a museum display right now alongside Neanderthals. Then, something strange slipped into the human mind. A mutation? A cognitive twist? A neurological glitch? Whatever it was, it unlocked language and imagination, allowing humans not just to describe reality, but to invent a shared reality. And once we could agree on shared realities, everything changed. A lion doesn't organize a hunting party of strangers. A wolf pack doesn't negotiate with a neighboring tribe about grazing boundaries. Chimps don't invent gods, nations, money, or corporations. Humans do, because we can tell each other things that aren't real and still believe them together. You might think that sounds easy, but look around. Not believing in anything is what most people call freedom. Yet the very idea of freedom, the idea that you have rights, that your nation matters, that money is valuable, exists only because enough people agreed it's real. Imagine a room of strangers, 100 people who've never met. Now imagine those 100 people deciding to build a town together, trade goods, defend borders, share food, and trust each other enough not to stab one another in the back. Without shared stories, that's impossible. A lion pack doesn't do it. A band of wolves doesn't do it. Heck, even modern humans struggle to cooperate with strangers without names on uniforms and laws on paper. So, where did this ability come from? Human brains didn't instantly get bigger, stronger, or faster. What changed was content, not capacity. We began to assign meaning to fictional constructs. Gods, spirits, mythologies, then tribal narratives, and eventually entire networks of shared belief that could span tribes, continents, and oceans. There's an academic twist here that most people miss. Other animals do use symbols. Bees communicate food locations. Dolphins have signature whistles, but only humans evolved symbolic language flexible enough to support shared fictions at a massive scale. That's what gave us the edge. Not brute force, not sharp teeth, not claws, but collective imagination. This ability had massive consequences. It allowed disparate tribes to cooperate long enough to pool resources. It enabled specialization. Some could hunt while others crafted tools, gathered plants, or kept watch. And it laid the groundwork for belief systems that could unify thousands, then millions, of individuals who'd never met, which no other species has ever done. Fast forward to today, and you see this same pattern still running the show, just in shinier packaging. The internet, for example, is the collective imagination on steroids. Our social networks, currencies like Bitcoin, multinational corporations, global religions, and even national identities are all collective stories we agree to believe in. Without shared belief, none of these systems would function. Governments collapse, economies fail, trust evaporates, and just recently, historians and thinkers like Harari are pointing out something even more uncomfortable. Modern technologies like artificial intelligence don't just amplify our shared stories, they create them. AI systems can generate narratives, memes, ideologies, and persuasive content that spreads faster than any human can fact-check, reshaping what entire societies believe within hours. This means the same thing that allowed ancient humans to dominate their environments, shared fiction, is now automating itself. We're no longer just believers. We are becoming content in a system that believes for us. That's where things get existential, because human cooperation wasn't built on truth. It was built on believable lies. Gods weren't real, but belief in gods bonded communities. Money wasn't real, but belief in money enabled trade. Nations aren't real, but belief in nations fueled loyalty and conflict. And if cooperation is built on shared fictions, then the very thing that made us powerful is also the thing that makes us manipulable. Think about it. When a corporation, a political campaign, or an AI can reshape your beliefs faster than your ancestors ever learned to make fire, what part of yourself is still real? That's the inheritance of the cognitive revolution and the burden. Key idea: humans dominate not because we were the strongest, fastest, or smartest, but because we invented shared fictions that enabled large-scale cooperation and organization. Key takeaway: the power of agreed-upon stories explains human dominance and also makes us vulnerable to the next wave of systems that generate belief without human oversight, like algorithms and AI. Favorite quote: "There are no gods, no nations, no money, and no human rights except in the common imagination of human beings." The lie that made us gods. They told you humans took over the world because we were smarter, faster, or stronger. Bullshit. The real reason we dominate isn't that we had better muscles or sharper teeth. It's that we invented fiction and then believed it so hard we convinced everyone else. That is the ugly, exhilarating, unbelievable truth at the heart of human history. About 70,000 years ago, long before nations, money, religion, phones, or memes, a tiny mutation occurred in the wiring of Homo sapiens' brains. Not a flashy mutation that gave us laser eyes or super speed. No, it gave us something far weirder and far more powerful. The ability to create stories that no one could touch, smell, or point to, and yet millions could believe together. That cognitive leap is what Harari calls the cognitive revolution, and it's what transformed an otherwise insignificant animal into the most dangerous force on the planet. Before that moment, humans were just like every other beast of Africa, foraging, scavenging, running from predators, and living lives that looked a lot like chimpanzees and gorillas. Nothing elite, nothing regal, nothing special. Yet with one evolutionary glitch, call it luck, call it fortune, call it fate, we began to tell tales about things that didn't exist: spirits, ancestors, taboos, gods, ghosts, fates, and myths. These weren't just campfire entertainment, they were shared universes of meaning, stories that allowed complete strangers to cooperate, trade, mate, and build systems together. And here's the kicker: other animals communicate. Dolphins whistle, bees dance, parrots mimic, but humans could talk about things that aren't actually real, narratives no one could point to, and yet everyone agreed were true enough to shape behavior. That's how millions of individuals with no biological ties suddenly started acting as one cohesive group. That's cooperation at scale. That's why empires, religions, and global markets were even possible. Now let's bring it into the modern world. We live in an age where narratives shape entire nations, not spears or swords. When headlines flood the globe about artificial intelligence taking over jobs, about currencies like Bitcoin that have no physical form, yet millions treat them as valuable, about political movements fueled by belief rather than empirical evidence. These are the echoes of the same psychological revolution our ancestors first stumbled upon 70,000 years ago. Social media doesn't make up reality, it just accelerates the ancient human ability to believe collectively in the unseen. Look at how a hashtag can spark a global movement overnight, or how conspiracy narratives can outweigh climate science in public perception, or how brands manipulate brand stories to generate consumer belief worth billions in market value. All of that works because humans don't just process data, we tell ourselves stories about that data. If you can shape the story, you can shape action. And that's the same mechanism that put humans at the top of the food chain. The rise of shared imagination wasn't a side effect, it was the core engine of our domination. Once humans could coordinate flexibly in large numbers, using myths to cement trust between complete strangers, everything else followed. Farming, cities, religions, armies, trade, governments, and eventually the global networks we see today. What looked like intelligence was really a storytelling system on steroids. And here's the part most histories never pause to confront. This cognitive leap didn't just make us powerful, it made us vulnerable, because the same narratives that bonded us can also blind us. Collective delusions are responsible for wars, financial crashes, pandemics of misinformation, tribalism, and global polarization. We still believe in unseen constructs, nations, gods, markets, progress, and we base real decisions on them every single day. So let that sink in. Humans conquered the world not because we were superior in some biological sense, but because we got addicted to collective make-believe. And then we handed that addiction down to every generation that followed. Key idea. What gives humans power is not physical strength or intelligence. It's the ability to construct complex shared narratives that bind large groups of strangers into cohesive social realities. Key takeaway. Our success as a species stems from our unique capacity for shared belief. But that same capacity makes us highly susceptible to manipulation, misinformation, and collective illusions. Favorite quote, ever since the cognitive revolution, sapiens have thus been living in a dual reality. On the one hand, the objective reality of rivers, trees, and lions, and on the other hand, the imagined reality of gods, nations, and corporations. Life before comfort was a trap. Humans have told themselves a lot of comforting lies about progress. We like to think that every invention, every city, every machine was a march forward. But what if, and this is where most people really start to squirm, the most dramatic shift in human life wasn't progress? What if it was the moment we left the forests and fields, stopped wandering and said, we'll plant here? For nearly 2 million years, Homo sapiens lived in a rhythm that didn't kill us. Gathering plants, hunting small game, knowing every tree and berry patch and predator instinctively. For almost all of human existence, people worked just enough to eat and spent the rest of their time socializing, resting, exploring, and living. Scientists who study foragers today, like the Ikong-san of the Kalahari, the Hadza in Tanzania, or the Ashe in Paraguay, consistently report something startling. Hunter-gatherers often had more leisure time, greater diet diversity, and less chronic stress than early farmers or modern office workers. Their lives weren't easy, but the rhythm was natural, responsive, fluid, not one of endless deadlines and debt. That wasn't weakness. It was evolution working as intended. Then came the agricultural revolution. Harari doesn't dance around it. He calls it history's biggest fraud. And he's not alone. Modern researchers have pointed out that agriculture didn't make life better for individuals. It made life easier for populations. Farming gave humans the ability to produce more food for more people, but individual farmers ended up eating less varied diets, working harder for survival, and living in crowded settlements where disease spread like wildfire. Compare that to nomadic bands that roamed and ate a rich variety of nuts, seeds, game, insects, and tubers. They weren't feasting on steak every day, but they weren't stuck eating 1-calorie poor crop either. There's a brutal logic to this transition. Food surpluses meant more children, which meant bigger populations, which meant that going back to the old way of life wasn't just undesirable. It was impossible without mass starvation. Suddenly, farming wasn't a choice, it was a trap. You planted, and then you were stuck. As one Reddit commenter put it, once farming had raised the population from 100 to 110, which 10 people should starve so the rest could revert to foraging. This wasn't ecology, it was arithmetic. Yet most of us still cling to the idea that progress equals more, better, faster, richer. But look around at the costs. In modern cities from Shanghai to Lagos, from Sao Paulo to Delhi, millions live in cramped environments, cranking out labor for cash they barely keep. They have air conditioning and social media, but they also have stress, anxiety, chronic disease, and ecological breakdown. Ask almost any youth whether they feel free, and you don't get back, yes, I'm thriving. You get exhaustion, burnout, comparison anxiety, The productivity gospel has come full circle. We left nature for farms to build civilization, then we left farms for skyscrapers to build economies, and now we're on a treadmill going nowhere except more consumption, more work, more distraction, and meanwhile, the world's media is obsessed with consumption as happiness. Netflix documentaries, wellness influencers, billionaire retreats, new gadget releases. We're told the next solution is always around the corner. But ancient psychology researchers remind us that happiness isn't about material abundance. It's about social bonds, purpose, community, and daily rhythms that align with our biology. Modern cities give us more stuff, but they also give us loneliness, isolation, and ecological grief. The sense that nature is something we lost, not something we belong to. This isn't to romanticize pre-industrial life. Infant mortality was real, medicine was non-existent, exposure to predators was constant, but it does challenge the common myth that biting the bullet and toiling for ever bigger surpluses was an inevitable improvement in quality of life. What if the sewer system, the smartphone, and the skyscraper are not the summit of human experience? What if they're just the latest layer of comfort built on top of stacking trade-offs that make our psyches and communities worse off? And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. The psychology of modern humans still carries the imprint of that old forager life. That's why we crave calories, why we panic in isolation, why we feel purposeless without community. These instincts were forged in environments where survival depended on caring for the group and knowing every nook of your world intimately. Our bodies remember the forest, even if our eyes only know concrete. So what have we gained? Population, cities, states, empires. But what have we lost? Autonomy, balance, a sense that life was ever about actual living, not just surviving to expand further. The expedition from forager to farmer wasn't straightforward evolution. It was a trap that reshaped who we are, locked us into systems we can't easily escape, and sold us the myth that more is automatically better. Key idea: the agricultural revolution didn't make individual lives better. It increased population and labor burdens while reducing dietary variety and autonomy, trapping humanity in a cycle of relentless cultivation and growth. Key takeaway: modern narratives of progress obscure the fact that farming reshaped human lives in ways that increased work, decreased variety and autonomy, and set the stage for the economic and psychological burdens of civilization. Favorite quote: humans didn't domesticate wheat, wheat domesticated humans. When progress betrayed us. Humans have a terrible habit of calling bad bargains progress. Ancient farmers didn't make that mistake, they just didn't know any better. And once their children were born into the field, the game was over. The shift from wandering the wild to staying in one place wasn't a choice so much as a trap that snapped shut around every human being alive at the time, and the consequences still shape our lives today. Around 12,000 years ago, something odd happened. It didn't feel like a revolution then, because revolutions are usually loud and unmistakable, but this one was subtle. It crept into the daily lives of humans so quietly that only our skeletons, soil layers, and our own belief systems remember it clearly. Humans began to plant seeds, to coax grasses and grains to grow in rows where once they gathered food casually from everywhere. They domesticated animals, not to set them free, but to control them. Wheat, rice, maize, barley. These crops would come to feed most of humanity, and humanity would never be the same. But here's the punch. Despite what your history teacher probably told you, this so-called agricultural revolution wasn't an upgrade for the average human. Harari doesn't pull punches, he calls it history's biggest fraud. That's because on an individual level, it didn't make life easier, healthier, or more fulfilling. It made it longer and more regimented, but at a cost. Farmers worked harder than foragers ever did, sun up to sundown, back bent, shoulders burned, and all to feed grains that do not nourish us the way wild foods once did. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate a variety of foods: fruits, nuts, roots, insects, meat, fish, traveling lightly and working only as much as needed to survive. Compare that to a world where your entire existence revolves around planting, tending, harvesting, storing, and protecting one crop. The evidence from ancient bones backs this up. Early agricultural skeletons show more disease, malnutrition, and physical strain than those of foragers. But here's the paradox that still haunts us. Farming did succeed in one dramatic way. It allowed humans to stick in one place, produce more calories per acre than a roaming band ever could, and multiply in number. Which means that although we individually lost variety and health, we collectively gained population growth and permanence. That's why cities, empires, and states could eventually emerge, because farming was sticky. Once people settled, they rarely returned to roaming life even if conditions improved. There's a powerful metaphor for today in that ancient bargain. Humanity traded freedom and variety for security and numbers. Sound familiar? Think about modern corporate jobs, student debt, 4-day work weeks that still feel like death marches, and endless apps promising convenience at the cost of your attention. We love to call this progress, but at its core, it works the exact same way the agricultural revolution did. You give up something fundamental, mobility, wellness, autonomy, in exchange for a promise of comfort or security that never quite arrives. Modern agriculture hasn't liberated us. It's industrialized the same trap. Monoculture crops, reliance on chemical fertilizers, global supply chains. The world's food system is now a highly leveraged illusion of abundance that breaks spectacularly when a drought, war, or pandemic hits. Look at global grain shortages and price spikes when Russia invaded Ukraine, or how climate change wreaks havoc on harvests across Africa, Asia, and South America all at once. Centuries after Harari's fraud, it's still biting us. And while humans now live longer on average, longevity doesn't equate to well-being. Modern diseases of civilization, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, are epidemic in societies built on agricultural crops. Our bodies were designed for variety, not for 60% of calories coming from a handful of staple grains. We may have domesticated wheat and rice, but in return, they domesticated our hunger and our diseases. There's also a global justice angle here that almost no one wants to confront. In many parts of the world, from the Sahel to parts of Southeast Asia, agricultural systems still fail to provide basic food security, forcing people into cycles of debt, climate vulnerability, and unstable markets. The promise of farming was supposed to be shelter and sustenance. Instead, for billions, it has often meant precarity and dependency. Meanwhile, surplus food in the West gets wasted, supermarkets overflowing with calories that contribute to public health crises. Across continents, humanity's agricultural system reflects the same contradiction. Multiply at all costs, even if individual lives are worse off. So what's the truth beneath the romanticized myth of progress? That farming was never just about food, it was about control of land, people, labor, and reproduction. Once humans started controlling their environment, they started controlling one another. Peoples who resisted farming didn't disappear overnight. In many isolated parts of Australia and the Amazon, there were sustainable long-term land management systems that didn't fit the classic Western narrative. But as farming peoples multiplied, their practices overwhelmed almost every ecosystem. Here's the uncomfortable lesson for today. Progress isn't linear. More technology isn't automatically better. A bigger population isn't the same as a better life. Every era that calls itself advanced layers new obligations on individuals while promising freedom. The agricultural revolution was the first example of that dynamic, and we've been repeating it ever since. Key idea: the agricultural revolution wasn't a simple step forward for humanity. It trapped individuals into labor-intensive lifestyles with worse diets and health, while enabling larger populations and permanent settlements. Key takeaway: Progress can be a trap when it prioritizes collective expansion and productivity over individual well-being and autonomy, a pattern that continues in modern systems of work, consumption, and technology. Favorite quote: "Humans didn't domesticate wheat, wheat domesticated humans." This isn't just history, it's a mirror showing what we choose to call progress and why we still pay for it today. Building civilizations on memory and muscle. Human history's most iconic monuments, stone giants like the Egyptian pyramids, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, Inca stone cities hidden in clouds, Angkor's temples swallowed by jungle, are often framed as triumphs of human genius. But what if they're better understood not as wonders of achievement, but as bruised monuments to the price people paid for cooperation and surplus? That's the uncomfortable reality at the heart of this era in human history. A moment when food production didn't just create more calories, it fueled hierarchies, power, and systems that would shape who lived and who served. Once humans settled, not by choice, but because surviving without settling became harder than surviving within a settlement, societies began producing not just food, but surplus food. That surplus wasn't cheered broadly as a blessing by everyone on earth. For most, it became a lever by which a few could control the many. Surplus meant that some people could store more than they needed, and those stores became leverage to demand labor, allegiance, and obedience from others who had less. That's where civilization begins, not as a victory of equality, but as a triumph of organized inequality. Let's be blunt. For most of prehistory, humans lived in flexible bands where reputation mattered more than wealth, where cooperation was direct, personal, negotiated face to face. Then surplus arrived, and suddenly a small elite could point to a storehouse or a collection of grain and say, "Give us your labor, your obedience, your future, or we withhold food." That subtle shift from community to surplus is what allowed societies to build pyramids, both literally and metaphorically. Those pyramids, the literal ones that still rise above the desert, were more than tombs. They were statements of power. They said, "We have enough to spare that we can break people's backs building monuments to eternity, while the majority still sweat for daily bread." Pharaohs didn't lift stones with their own hands. Peasants did because hierarchy had teeth, and the same pattern repeated globally. Empires in the Indus Valley, dynasties in China, the steppes under Mongol Khans, Ayutthaya in Southeast Asia. Centralized control rooted neither in benevolence nor fairness, but in systems that could concentrate surplus, allocate labor, and create order out of scale. And then came memory overload. Not a technology buzzword, but a real historical turning point when humans realized their brains were simply not designed for the complexity of these vast social networks. Early humans could remember the faces, habits, and trustworthiness of a few dozen beings. They could not manage the thousands of rules, roles, transactions, and hierarchies that arose when settlements grew into cities and kingdoms. So they invented writing and record keeping, not for poetry or art at first, but to track who owed what, who owned what, who was punished for what, who was born into what status. It was bookkeeping for social order. Before writing, rules lived in memory and in fleeting social bonds. After writing, they could be set in stone, encoded into law, tax codes, temple decrees, and imperial edicts. Writing made it possible not only to remember vast amounts of data, but to delegate memory itself to a system, scripts, ledgers, bureaucracies. If humans had been independent individuals before, writing tethered them to external systems of power and authority. It wasn't only writing that made civilization possible. Numbers followed, tools for trade, taxation, measurement, timekeeping. Long before computers, humans taught their civilizations how to think in numbers, debts, interest, shares, credit, taxes. Without them, the modern world, global trade, markets, states simply couldn't exist. Numbers became the syntax of bureaucratic order. But here's where the narrative flips on its head. All of this apparently beneficial complexity also created hierarchies that never unmade themselves. The surplus that built pyramids also built systems of inequality, elite versus commoners, rulers versus ruled, those with power versus those without. A new study released in April 2025 by researchers at Washington State University shows that wealth inequality has roots deeper than written history, growing gradually after the agricultural transition and well before powerful empires, suggesting that once surplus systems develop, hierarchy inevitably follows. So while the story of civilization often celebrates monumental achievements, pyramids, temples, scripts, empires, the gritty truth is that these achievements weren't milestones on a gentle climb toward human flourishing. They were often symptoms of systems that rationed power, controlled resources, and magnified inequality. Giant monuments and large bureaucracies are impressive cartoons. The human cost behind them, often invisible in popular histories, was not. Even today, we see echoes of this transformation. The balance between centralization and autonomy remains unresolved. Global financial systems, multinational corporations, international institutions, they function because we've extended the ancient mechanisms of cooperation, stories, symbols, writing, numbers, to the entire planet. Yet the inequities they create, wealth concentration in boardrooms and capitals, while the many struggle to afford basics, reflect old patterns stretched across a global stage. The digital age hasn't abolished hierarchy, it's augmented it with algorithms and networks that can reorder wealth and influence faster than any ancient empire ever could. Here's the bottom line: human social complexity didn't create fairness. It created scale and control, and then wrote manuals for managing it. If you're uncomfortable with that idea, it might be because much of human identity, including stories of progress and enlightenment, is built on ignoring how deep inequality really runs. Key idea: surplus food enabled large-scale cooperation, but it also made hierarchical social structures and monumental inequalities possible, cemented through writing, numbers, and record-keeping. Key takeaway: the systems that allowed humans to cooperate in massive societies also created the persistent hierarchies and inequalities we still struggle with in modern global systems. Favorite quote: "Few question the myths that cause us to desire the pyramid in the first place." The world was never fair and never meant to be. Human history is one long battlefield between stories we tell ourselves and the violent reality those stories create. We like to imagine that humans naturally want fairness, that deep down we believe in justice, equal opportunity, human rights, that the age of enlightenment made us better than brute force and tribal customs. But that's a comforting myth. The cruel truth is that inequality is built into the very foundations of our civilizations. And it wasn't an accident, it wasn't some temporary glitch, it wasn't even a necessary evil. It was manufactured. Once humans started living in big societies, after agriculture and surplus food made dense populations possible, they didn't suddenly become nicer or wiser. They became experts in organizing inequality. To justify unequal power, wealth, status, privileges became stories we all agreed to. Imagined orders that allowed some humans to command others, some to own resources, and others to be excluded from those resources entirely. Think about how odd that is. On one hand, humans are biologically equal. Every newborn baby is dependent. Every adult human feels pain, joy, loss, desire. On the other hand, in most societies throughout history, and still today, differences in power, wealth, prestige, and status determine who lives well and who barely survives. Harari argues, quite uncomfortably, that justice, equality, fairness, these are not objective laws baked into the universe. They are imagined orders, stories told so often and so convincingly that we mistake them for natural laws. Look at Hammurabi's Code, one of the oldest legal systems in human history. It didn't say, all humans get fair treatment. It said life, limb, fines, and penalties depended on social class. If a noble broke a commoner's bone, they paid a fine. If a commoner broke a noble's bone, the commoner died. That is inequality not just recorded as law, but sanctified by law. Fast forward to modern times, and you think we fixed that, right? Except the patterns look eerily similar, just dressed up in different costumes. In 2025, the World Inequality Report found that fewer than 60,000 people, roughly 0.001% of the global population, control 3 times the wealth of the poorest half of humanity. That's not a random quirk. That's the modern equivalent of Hammurabi's law, written in dollars and cents instead of stone tablets. And it's not just statistics. Across Europe, poverty has surged to levels not seen in decades. In France, nearly 10 million people live below the official poverty threshold, even as GDP grows. The richest 20% earn more than 4 times what the poorest 20% take home. That's inequality baked into the economy, not carved into stone, but structurally no less rigid. Globally, inequality isn't a problem at the margins. It's a crisis affecting billions. A 2025 United Nations report warns of a world where rising inequality, economic insecurity, and distrust are tearing at the seams of social cohesion. 2.8 billion people, more than a third of humanity, live on just a few dollars a day, hovering at the brink of extreme poverty. And with job insecurity rising, trust in governments falling, and misinformation spreading, the very glue that holds societies together is dissolving. None of this is accidental. These are the same fundamental logics that Harari traces back to early civilizations, imagined orders that became real in their consequences. Once elites controlled surplus resources, they needed stories to justify that control. Gods gave us privilege. Your caste is natural. Your race is inferior. Your market value reflects your worth. Those stories became structural forces, embedded in scripture, in law, and eventually in global economics. It's important to be clear. Inequality is not simply about having more or less stuff. It's about access to power, opportunity, dignity, and voice. When wealth concentrates at the top, political influence concentrates with it. The richest 1% of the world's population has gained more wealth in the last decade than the rest of humanity combined, a level of concentration that undermines democracy itself. And inequality doesn't just harm economic fairness, it weakens entire societies. A global health report from 2025 revealed that inequality makes pandemics more likely, more severe, and more costly. Poorer communities get sick more often, die more frequently, and recover more slowly, while wealthier groups insulate themselves. These disparities shape global catastrophe outcomes, not random chance. But inequality isn't inevitable just because history is long. It persists because we keep mistaking our stories for reality. When a society accepts that rich people deserve more because they worked harder, or because they have better genes, or because they somehow earned it in a meritocratic system, that's not biology talking. That's narrative power at work, distributed through culture, absorbed in childhood, and reinforced every time we scroll a feed that glorifies billionaires, celebrities, and elites. And don't think it's only economic. Gender, caste, race, ethnicity, nationality, all of these divisions have been justified historically by imaginaries that claim they are natural or inevitable. Harari holds up the mirror to societies from India's long caste histories to legal systems in ancient Mesopotamia to modern structural racism. In every case, inequality was written into the story first, then enforced in reality. The uncomfortable truth is that history is not a ladder leading to fairness. It's a web of stories that powerful groups wrote to justify their dominance. And even today, when liberal democracies champion equality, the imagined orders of capitalism, property, citizenship, and meritocracy quietly preserve the status of the few while demanding compliance from the many. Key idea: inequality is not a natural condition, but a product of imagined social orders that assign power and privilege to certain groups while excluding others. A pattern that persists from ancient law codes to modern global economics. Key takeaway: justice and equality are not given by history. They must be actively constructed and defended, because left unexamined, the stories we adopt will default to serving those with the most power, just as they have throughout human history. Favorite quote: "There is no universal standard of justice. All the stories that underpin the social orders are fictional." One world, one story. Human history isn't a peaceful parade of inventions and breakthroughs. It's a massive collision between systems that force strangers to cooperate and the fragile human beings who never really asked to be forced. If the agricultural revolution built the puzzle pieces of society, then money, empires, and religion are the forces that glued them together into something that looks unified, but wasn't always equitable or benevolent. They are the imagined realities that turned millions of solitary individuals into global civilizations with shared goals, shared markets, and shared powers, sometimes at horrific cost. Before money, before kingdoms, before universal religions, humans were tribes. Small bands of people whose social logic was face-to-face trust. You helped me, and I helped you. But when societies began to scale, after farming made large populations possible, that system broke. You can't trust a stranger in Timbuktu the same way you trust your neighbor in a small village. So humans invented money, not as coins or banknotes at first, but as an abstract system of mutual belief that turned barley, shells, or precious metals into universally accepted symbols of value. Money doesn't have intrinsic meaning. It works only because we collectively agree to pretend it does. That's not a trivial idea. It is the core hack that lets us cooperate beyond immediate communities. Money is the trust engine coined by society. It means a stranger in Mumbai can trade with a stranger in Lagos using the same currency or digital number and believe in its worth. The magical part? Money works even if the people carrying it don't trust each other personally. They trust the idea, which is more astonishing and more fragile than you think. But money didn't just unify, it reshaped values. Once economic logic creeps into every corner of life, everything becomes measured by price, including health, community, dignity, and even personal identity. Look at the way digital currencies emerged globally. Everyday conversations now include Bitcoin, Ethereum, NFTs, national digital wallets, and even cross-border microtransactions. People who barely know their neighbors understand market fluctuations better than their own rights at work. Monetary logic has seeped into how humans measure self-worth. Parallel to the economic order was the imperial order. Empires didn't just conquer lands, they conquered stories about people. They told entire populations that they weren't separate tribes anymore. They were subjects of one empire, citizens of a vast imagined political community. The Persian empires, Roman dominions, Mongol hordes, Islamic caliphates, European colonial networks, all worked by folding diverse cultures into a single political identity. That sounds like unity, but it often meant crushing indigenous worlds, histories, and identities in the process. Look at today's world. The legacy of imperialism isn't dead. Former colonies still grapple with imposed borders, languages, legal systems, and economic scripts written by distant rulers. The British Empire spread railroads and idea systems, but it also enforced hierarchies and exploitation that echo through India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Empires gave some people infrastructure, but they also gave many people the story that their culture was inferior. That isn't accidental. It's the psychological architecture of power. And then there's religion, not just faith in gods, but systems of norms and values that humans have used to unify tribes into mass followings. Harari defines religion, in a broad sense, as any belief system founded on a superhuman order that shapes behavior and culture. That includes ancient animism, polytheism, monotheism, but it also includes modern ideologies like nationalism, capitalism, and even certain political religions that demand faith in a particular system of rules. Religion fills a psychological need that economic and political orders can't. It gives meaning. Empires and markets can make cooperation possible, but religion makes cooperation compelling. Millions of Muslims pray toward Mecca every day. Millions of Christians sing hymns on Sundays. Millions of others find spiritual grounding in Buddhism, Hinduism, or indigenous traditions. Those practices aren't just beliefs. They're social glue that holds disparate individuals in shared rituals of meaning. And yet, religion also has a dark side. It's been one of the most durable justifications for violence and division. The Crusades, the conquest of the Americas, sectarian wars in the Middle East, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, all claimed divine sanction. Even today, conflicts framed in religious terms between Sunni and Shia groups, tensions in Israel and Palestine, and violent extremists in East Africa show how meaning systems can be twisted into reasons to kill. So what has all this accomplished? Money, empires, and religion have indeed unified mankind in the sense that the world today is interconnected through global markets, universal languages of finance, and overlapping fields of belief. But this unity hasn't erased difference, it has reshaped it. Cultures still exist, but they operate within global systems that determine who gets to thrive and who gets to survive. A person born in Tokyo and a person born in Lagos share global trade networks, but they do not share equal access to wealth, health, or opportunity. And that matters. Here's the punch. The systems that make global cooperation possible are the same systems that hide the fractures beneath it. Money makes trade possible, but it also commodifies human value. Empires created common law and shared infrastructure, but they also imposed hierarchical worldviews. Religions give meaning and ethics, but they can justify violence and exclusion. Unity is not necessarily justice, and sometimes unity is just a disguise for power. Key idea: human unification occurred through three universal orders: economic, money, political, empires, and cultural, religion, which enabled cooperation at massive scale by creating shared imagined realities accepted by millions. Key takeaway: the forces that bind humanity, money, empire, religion, do not guarantee fairness or well-being. They shape our cooperation, but also mediate power, identity, and inequality across the globe. Favorite quote: "Money is the most universal and efficient system of mutual trust ever devised." The invisible code of success. History doesn't give medals to the best cultures. It hands victory to the most adaptable, most contagious, most mimetically virulent systems of belief and organization. What we call success isn't about justice or goodness. It's about which ideas, systems, and cultural patterns outpace the rest, infecting minds and societies so effectively that they dominate entire continents and millennia. That's the brutal thesis in Harari's Anatomy of Cultural Success, and it dismantles the comforting myth that what prevails does so because it's good for humans. Take a step back and think about it. The religion with the most believers isn't necessarily the one with the best theology. It's the one that spread and sustained itself. The empire with the most lasting influence wasn't always the most humane. It was the one that absorbed others, reshaped identities, and controlled resources effectively. The economic model that today underpins global trade isn't morally superior. It's the one that scaled, adapted, and integrated millions into a shared market logic. These aren't tidy judgments, they're evolutionary assessments of ideas and institutions as replicators in the cultural ecosystem. Harari punctures the illusion that history marches towards some cosmic moral arc. Instead, he shows that history's winners often triumphed for reasons as chaotic and contingent as a random mutation in the brain of an early human. What looks inevitable in hindsight, English as a global lingua franca, capitalism as a dominant economic model, monotheism as a major religious force, democracy as a widely accepted political ideal were all just one possibility among many. At the moment, they weren't predetermined, and in another world, they might never have taken hold. This is where Harari brings in the idea that the secret of success isn't virtue, it's mimetic flexibility. Cultures that can absorb, reshape, and repurpose ideas are far more likely to survive than those locked into rigid dogmas or local traditions. Consider the spread of Buddhism across Asia, a belief system born in a small region of India that adapted to Chinese thought, coexisted with Confucian ethics, and found relevance in Japan centuries later. Its success wasn't because it was true, it was because its narrative could integrate diverse contexts. Contrast that with the fate of many indigenous belief systems around the world. From the Americas to Australia, rich cosmologies and spiritual worldviews were overwhelmed by religions and empires that had organizational reach, missionary zeal, and structured literacy systems. That's not a tragic accident, it's a structural feature of cultural evolution. Ideas spread, but not all ideas spread equally. Here's where the narrative gets even sharper. The secret of success also involves the hindsight fallacy. People today look back at history as if outcomes were obvious or natural, when in reality they were highly contingent. Emperor Constantine could have made any number of religions the state faith of Rome. A plague, a diplomatic decision, or a military event could have shifted the entire religious landscape of Europe. That doesn't diminish the power of religion. It highlights how fragile dominant cultural orders really are. In modern contexts, we see echoes of this dynamic everywhere. Take global capitalism. It didn't emerge because it's the moral economic system. It emerged because the stories of credit, corporations, markets, and innovation spread faster, replicated more effectively, and adapted to changing environments. Today, capitalism is deeply interwoven with science, education, and governance in ways that pre-modern economies could never have imagined. But like all successful cultural systems, it has downsides, including deep inequalities and environmental degradation that aren't bugs, but integral features of how it replicates value. Look at news reports from around the world. In Europe and Africa alike, nations wrestle with the contradictions of global economic integration, jobs outsourced, markets interconnected, debts reshaped by distant central banks. In Asia, the rise of China challenges the dominance of Western economic narratives, not because it offers a better culture, but because its model is effective at mobilizing resources and narratives of growth on a massive scale. That's mimetic success on a global scale. The same dynamic plays out in the digital world. Social media platforms don't win because they're inherently good. They win because their algorithms amplify the most engaging narratives, not the most truthful ones. A meme that triggers fear, identity, or outrage spreads faster than a calm fact. That's memetics in real time, the same principle Harari sees operating across millennia, except today it's happening in microseconds. So what does this mean for us, sitting here in the 21st century, scrolling screens and voting in global economies shaped by centuries of cultural evolution? It means the systems we live in, capitalism, nationalism, religion, technology, are not the pinnacle of human virtue. They are what survived, not what was inherently best. They are successful because they are flexible, adaptive, and contagious, not because they guarantee human welfare. This doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat old cycles. It means we must be honest about success. It's not a moral accolade, it's a descriptor of what spreads. And if we confuse success with goodness, we surrender the future to narratives that may not serve human flourishing at all. Key idea: success in human history doesn't follow moral logic. It follows mimetic adaptability, the ability of ideas, institutions, and cultural systems to replicate, adapt, and outcompete others in a complex social ecosystem. Key takeaway: dominant cultures and systems survived not because they were inherently better, but because they were better at spreading and adapting, and recognizing that helps us understand and potentially reshape the narratives governing our world. Favorite quote: "The most successful cultures are not necessarily the most righteous, just the most contagious and adaptable." Knowledge, power, and the illusion of control. Imagine a world where not knowing becomes the engine that drives everything humans have ever built. This sounds like a paradox, that ignorance, not certainty, is the real breakthrough. But by the time the scientific revolution rolled across the globe, beginning around the 1500s, that's exactly what happened. Before then, most societies, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Confucian, and indigenous, treated knowledge as something fixed, sacred, already known. But suddenly, a new idea took hold. We don't actually know, and admitting that didn't make humans weaker, it made them terrifyingly powerful. This intellectual earthquake didn't happen in a vacuum. It emerged in a Europe where empires, trade networks, and wealth were already expanding. But recognizing ignorance and intentionally trying to overcome it was novel. Scholars started testing nature, not just quoting ancient texts. They measured, observed, experimented. When Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter's moons, or when Copernicus suggested the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, it wasn't just scientific discovery. It was a fundamental rebellion against assumed truths. Suddenly, belief had to earn its place through evidence. What made this shift explosive wasn't just ideas. It was power structures that funded them. The rise of capitalism created an ethos where trust in the future became the cornerstone of economic life. Credit was invented. Money created not from existing savings, but from belief in economic growth still to come. Banks loaned money based on futures that didn't yet exist, and that faith in progress fueled investment, exploration, and technological expansion. European ships circled the globe not solely because of maps, but because financiers cut deals on the promise of returns. This isn't some abstract economic arc. It's the reason you carry a phone connected to the internet built on technologies no one could have imagined 400 years ago. The scientific revolution created a feedback loop. Admit ignorance to fund research to overcome it, to build technologies that change society, to reinforce belief in progress, to fund more research. It's an engine that never stops. Industrial capitalism and modern science are like conjoined twins. Capitalism said, growth is the supreme value. A tree falls in the forest not because it must, but because markets expect output to be higher tomorrow than today. Science provided tools, and capitalism provided incentive and resources. Governments and corporations poured capital into science, not simply out of curiosity, but because they expected power, profit, security, and advantage. Harvard economics professor Danny Roderick and others have documented how democracies with complex economies tend to invest heavily in research and innovation to stay competitive globally, a pattern far from unique to the West. The marriage of science and empire underwrote global domination. European powers didn't conquer the world by virtue of divine right or racial superiority. They did it by equipping themselves with navigational tech, metallurgy, gunpowder, and better ships. Scientists mapped coastlines, logged winds, and calculated trajectories. In exchange, empires offered funding and security for labs and academies. Science became a weapon of dominance as much as a tool for understanding. Yet the original promise that science would liberate humanity has a dark underside. The same systems that give us vaccines, space travel, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy also give us surveillance capitalism, biotech that edits genomes, and autonomous weapons. Look at AI today. It's touted as humanity's greatest advance, a reflection of scientific power. But critics like historian Yuval Harari argue AI may evolve into something that doesn't just serve human needs, but replaces human roles in governance, commerce, and even meaning-making, effectively reshaping what it means to be human. The globe today is a testament to this mashup of science, industry, and belief in progress. In China, massive government investment in technology has positioned the nation as a leader in AI, quantum computing, and biotech, not because of some moral edge, but because the scientific progress means power, narrative has taken root in the highest offices of state. In India and Brazil, scientific research has unlocked new agricultural yields and medical capacities that weren't imaginable a century ago, even while local debates rage over economic inequality and indigenous rights. In Africa, science is both empowering and disorienting. Smartphone adoption has leapfrogged traditional infrastructure, yet questions remain about who controls data and whose narratives guide technological futures. All of these global rhythms, from Shanghai to Nairobi to Sao Paulo, are shaped by the same core dynamic the scientific revolution unleashed. This system doesn't just create tools, it restructures societies. The Industrial Revolution, powered by coal and oil and electricity, changed how humans imagine time, work, and life. Cities grew not around villages or temples, but around factories, railroads, and power grids. People stopped being defined solely by kin or local tradition. They became workers, consumers, citizens of nations woven into a global economy. And that economy depends on constant motion, not equilibrium. We like to think science is neutral, objective, and noble, but the reality is grittier. Science is entwined with power. It's funded by interest with agendas, prone to misuse, and often justified as progress even when its effects are ambiguous or harmful. The very belief in progress, that tomorrow will be better than today if only we invest enough in knowledge, has driven unprecedented innovation and profound inequality. It's what puts vaccines in arms and algorithms in prisons. It's what makes life expectancy soar in Tokyo and stagnate in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where resources for research and infrastructure are limited. So what's the lesson here? It's not that science is bad, it's that science, capitalism, and industry reshaped reality itself, not through organic historical inevitability, but through a series of choices about what humans chose to value, fund, and believe. In that sense, modern science is just the latest set of shared stories, except now those stories have tangible power. The power to alter genomes, to remake cities, to project influence across oceans, to decide whom we insure, employ, imprison, or cure. Key idea. The modern world was shaped not by certainty, but by the bold embrace of ignorance as opportunity, fueling intertwined scientific, economic, and industrial systems that continually transform human societies and their futures. Key takeaway. Growth, progress, and innovation aren't inevitable products of human goodness. They are results of systems that treat ignorance as the raw material of power and use capitalism, science, and industry as tools to turn belief in progress into material force. Favorite quote? The real spike in human power began when we decided that not knowing was just the beginning of the journey, not the end of it. The end of being human. If the arc of human history were meant to be a feel-good story about progress, the ending would be much less awkward than it actually is. We rack up technological achievements like trophies, biotech labs that edit DNA, rockets landing themselves on asteroids, AI systems writing sonnets and diagnosing diseases, and yet we still don't have a satisfying answer to the oldest question there is. Are we truly better off? That's what Harari pushes us to confront as his sweeping narrative nears its conclusion. Not just how we got here, but what all this accumulated power has actually done to us, psychologically, socially, biologically, and what it might do next when Homo sapiens isn't even the final version of ourselves. Modern humans live in an age of astonishing capability. We've cured diseases that once wiped out entire villages, we've mapped the human genome, and we've built societies capable of supporting billions of lives in relative peace compared to earlier centuries. And yet subjective well-being, psychological contentment, a sense of purpose, real happiness, doesn't skyrocket in proportion to our luxuries. Rich countries with generous social systems still report widespread anxiety, loneliness, and depression. Research into happiness shows that after basic material needs are met, additional wealth doesn't significantly increase happiness levels. What matters more are relationships, community, and mental health. And modern life, with its atomized individuals and fragmented social structures, often undermines those very things. Harari pulls no punches. The fact that life expectancy and material comfort have improved doesn't mean that life feels better for most people. The average person today might have a more comfortable bed and cleaner water than a 14th century peasant, but they also have higher expectations, deeper comparisons, and more relentless pressures, social, professional, and technological, that previous generations didn't face, simply because mass media and global connectivity magnify every aspect of modern life. The ancient forager who survived on diverse diets and lived in tight-knit social groups might well have experienced greater subjective happiness despite hardship, because their expectations and social frameworks were fundamentally different. This isn't just armchair philosophy. Psychologists studying subjective well-being, the fancy term for how individuals internally assess their lives, find that happiness correlates far more with mental states and social belonging than with income or material status beyond a modest threshold. Nations with higher GDPs don't automatically score higher on happiness indexes. In some cases, they score lower because rising material wealth escalates expectations and fuels dissatisfaction. That's partly why massive economic growth in many parts of the world has coincided with rising anxiety disorders, loneliness, and burnout, even as physical health and longevity improve. But Harari doesn't leave us at a melancholy meditation on human dissatisfaction. He pivots towards something far more unsettling. What comes after Homo sapiens? The very forces we once harnessed to understand the world, science and technology, are now transforming the nature of the world and ourselves. No longer are we merely discoverers of natural laws. We are becoming designers of life itself. Advances in genetic editing, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence mean that the species that once adapted to nature through random mutations and natural selection may soon intentionally reshape its own biology. From gene editing that eradicates inherited diseases, to neural interfaces that meld minds with machines, to AI systems that surpass human cognitive capacities, humankind stands on the cusp of an era where the concept of human, as we've known it, could become obsolete. This isn't speculation plucked from sci-fi fantasy. It's grounded in real scientific trajectories that are already underway. For instance, CRISPR gene editing is being used in clinical trials to cure genetic disorders once considered untouchable. AI systems already outperform humans in complex pattern recognition tasks, and companies worldwide are investing massively in neurotechnology aimed at augmenting cognition. This reconfiguration of life isn't accidental, it's an intentional project of science and power intersecting, and it raises the most profound ethical questions humanity has ever faced. Who gets access to enhancement? What happens to equality when intelligence and longevity are commodities? What happens when death itself becomes treatable at the molecular level? While historian Harari doesn't presume to offer definitive answers, he pushes the reader to confront a raw possibility. Perhaps Homo sapiens, as a species defined by biology, mortality, and shared human experience, is not the endpoint of evolution, but a transitional stage. Future iterations could be biologically engineered superhumans, cyborg hybrids, or beings whose existence is so altered that our current notions of identity, consciousness, and meaning no longer apply. The technology that once extended our lives now threatens to rewrite what it means to be alive. So what does this mean for the everyday human mind? the everyday life lived on streets from Nairobi to New Delhi to Buenos Aires. It means that the pursuit of progress, long framed as an unalloyed good, is courting contradictions. Material comfort and scientific mastery don't guarantee satisfaction or meaning. In fact, they may intensify the very restlessness that has driven human innovation in the first place. As people increasingly measure happiness by expectations rather than actual experiences, dissatisfaction can become built into the architecture of contemporary life. The big takeaway isn't just that happiness has stagnated despite progress, it's that the future of humanity might look very different from any human history we've ever known. The species that once stood atop the planet because of its mastery of imagination and cooperation may soon be replaced by beings who don't need to imagine the impossible because they built it. Key idea: despite unprecedented advances in material conditions and scientific power, subjective happiness hasn't proportionally increased, and humanity may be on the brink of transforming itself into a post-human species with radically different biological and cognitive traits. Key takeaway: progress measured by technology and comfort doesn't equal happiness. As humans gain power to reshape life itself through biotechnology and AI, the definition of what it means to be human is in flux, raising ethical, psychological, and social challenges far beyond anything previous generations faced. Favorite quote: "Nothing in the comfortable lives of the average modern Westerner can approach the joy of a forager gathering mushrooms in a forest." Conclusion: so what have we actually been doing this entire time? We've tracked humanity from a random ape with no cosmic resume to a species that remade the world in its own image. Not because we were destined, superior, or divinely chosen, but because we learned to tell stories that millions could believe together. We followed that spark of imagination, the cognitive revolution, and saw how fictions became the glue of human cooperation. Money, gods, nations, markets, all invisible until enough people agreed they were real. That's not myth-busting, that's history with the masks ripped off. Then we looked at the so-called progress of farming and realized something deeply unsettling. What we call advancement was often a trap disguised as improvement. More mouths, more labor, more chains, all justified as civilization. When surplus food became power, it created hierarchies, empires, and the first structural inequality. The pyramids weren't monuments of glory, they were monuments of organized labor and social obligation. We traced how ideas and systems grew into empires, money networks, religions, and cultural forces that stitched human societies into a global quilt, but not a quilt of fairness. A quilt with seams you can still see today, in the gap between the privileged and those left behind, in how laws and markets still favor the few while telling the many that the system is meritocratic. We explored how some cultures spread and dominated not because they were morally better, but because their stories spread more effectively, a brutal evolutionary logic of ideas, not morals. And then we saw how the scientific revolution turned ignorance from a liability into the raw material of power, reshaping not just what we know, but how we live, work, and define ourselves. At every turn, the same theme surfaces. Shared imagination, not objective truth, is the currency of human power. We collaborated with it, were liberated by it, and were trapped by it. And now here's the real punch. All that collective power, the science, industry, networks, wealth, global systems, hasn't guaranteed happiness. In many places it has increased comfort, but also anxiety, isolation, and disconnection, because we never learned how to manage the narratives inside our own minds. We're wired for small groups, but we live in massive networks. We treat algorithms as oracles and compare our lives to highlight reels we didn't invite into our psyches. But the story doesn't just end with dissatisfaction, it ends with transformation. The technologies we've built, CRISPR, AI, neurointerfaces, genetic editing, aren't just extensions of human capability. They are tools that can redefine what it means to be human. The species that once dominated by telling shared stories might soon be replaced by beings who write their own biology. And that is both the most thrilling and terrifying chapter of all. So here's the final truth you should not take lightly. We are not the peak of evolution. We are a phase, a wild chapter where imagination became power, where beliefs built worlds, where knowledge and technology rewired life itself. And as we stand at the edge of rewriting what being alive means, we must ask ourselves, are we shaping the future, or are we just the last version of the past? That's the legacy Harari dares us to confront, not with fear, but with clarity, courage, and responsibility. If this breakdown ignited something in you, curiosity, discomfort, ambition, or even outrage, then take it further. The book that inspired this journey lays all these ideas bare at a depth no summary can fully capture. Read it for yourself, think for yourself, challenge yourself. That's how you escape comfortable illusions and start shaping a future worth inheriting. If you learned something raw and real today, if your perspective just shifted even a little, hit like, share this with someone who needs a reality check, and subscribe because the hardest truths are often the ones most worth hearing. And most importantly, don't just survive history, understand it, question it, and use it to build something better. That's how you don't just live. That's how you become conscious of the world you've inherited and the future you're about to create.